That moment when a police officer walks up to your car and casually taps your taillight. Most people barely even notice it. It feels routine, harmless, almost like muscle memory. But what if I told you that tiny tap just triggered something that could shape everything that happens next, and more importantly, everything that happens later in court? Because in the next 60 seconds after that touch, you're either protecting yourself or you're unknowingly giving the officer exactly what they need to build a case against you. And here's the part that should make you pay attention. Most drivers lose that moment before a single word is even spoken. No argument, no confrontation, no mistake that feels obvious. Just small automatic reactions that get written down, interpreted, and used. That tap on your tail light isn't random. It's not meaningless. It's part of a sequence, a trained, deliberate sequence. And if you don't understand what it sets in motion, you're already behind before the conversation even begins. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly what that moment means, why lawyers pay close attention to it, and the precise moves that can either shut things down quickly or quietly escalate everything without you realizing it. Because once you see what's actually happening during a traffic stop, you won't experience one the same way again. Hi, I'm Sophia, and I've spent a long time studying how traffic stops actually play out, not just from the driver's perspective, but through real footage, real cases, and the exact strategies defense attorneys rely on when these situations end up in court. What I'm about to walk you through isn't theory or guesswork. It's based on patterns that show up again and again in real stops and on legal principles that have been tested all the way up to the Supreme Court. We're going to break this down step by step. Why officers touch your tail light in the first place, what they're observing for in those first critical seconds, the exact words that can protect you, and the common responses that quietly make things worse. I'll also show you how the same traffic stop can go in two completely different directions, depending on just a few small decisions you make in the moment. And as we go, pay attention to how early everything starts. Because the biggest advantage you can have during a traffic stop isn't what you say later, it's what you do right at the beginning. In the next part, we're going to zoom in on what's really happening the second those lights come on behind you, and why most people completely misunderstand that moment. Most people think a traffic stop begins when the officer reaches your window and starts talking. That's what it feels like from the driver's seat. You pull over, you wait, and then the interaction starts. But in reality, the stop begins the second those lights come on behind you. And by the time the officer is walking up to your car, they've already been observing you for far longer than you realize. They're observing how quickly you pull over, whether you hesitate, whether you drift, whether you make any sudden movements inside the vehicle. They're observing your mirrors, your shoulders, your hands. Even before they step out of their patrol car, they're forming a picture of what kind of stop this is going to be. Calm and routine, or something potentially requiring caution. And here's where it gets important. None of this requires you to do anything obviously wrong. You don't have to violate regulations in a dramatic way. Small instinctive behaviors are enough. Reaching across the seat, digging into a bag, leaning down out of view for a second. Those tiny movements can get noted, remembered, and later written into a report in a way that sounds far more serious than it felt in the moment. By the time the officer is approaching your vehicle, they're not just walking up. They're confirming or adjusting the assumptions they've already started building. And that's exactly where the taillight touch comes in, right at the transition between observation and direct interaction. Because that quick tap on your taillight isn't just a habit. It serves two very specific purposes, and one of them matters to you far more than most people realize. The first is straightforward. It's a physical marker. By touching your vehicle, the officer leaves behind fingerprints that place them at that exact car at that exact moment in time. If anything unusual happens during the stop, anything at all, that contact can later be used as part of the evidence trail. It's simple, it's procedural, and it's been standard practice in many departments for years. But the second reason is where things start to shift in a way that directly affects you. That touch can act as a subtle trigger. A way to see how you react when you're startled or caught off guard. Not in an obvious, dramatic way, but just enough to provoke a natural, unfiltered response. Do you suddenly reach for something? Do you turn quickly? Do your hands disappear from view? Even a small flinch or a quick movement toward the glove box can stand out. And here's why that matters. Those reactions can be interpreted as signs of nervousness or potential concern, and then documented as such. Once that observation is written into a report, it can be referenced to justify expanding the scope of the stop under what's known as reasonable suspicion. In plain terms, that means the officer can point to a specific behavior, your behavior, as a reason to look deeper, ask more questions, or take the interaction further than a simple traffic matter. And the key thing to understand is this. Your reaction to that single tap can quietly influence everything that follows. Most drivers don't even realize they're being evaluated in that moment, but that's often where the direction of the entire stop is decided. So, now that you understand what that tail light touch actually signals, here's the part that matters most. What you do in the first few seconds after it happens. Because this is the moment where most drivers unintentionally create challenges for themselves without even realizing it. The instinct is almost automatic. You get pulled over, your mind jumps straight to, let me grab my license, let me get my registration ready. And before the officer even reaches your window, you're already reaching across the car, opening compartments, moving your hands out of sight. It feels responsible, it feels cooperative. But from the officer's perspective, walking up to your vehicle, it looks very different. All they see is movement, hands disappearing, reaching into unknown areas before they've even made contact with you. And that single observation, driver was reaching into the glove box before I approached the vehicle, can end up written into a report in a way that instantly raises the level of caution for the rest of the stop. The smarter move is much simpler, and it's far more powerful than most people expect. The moment you stop the car, you place both hands clearly on the steering wheel and you keep them there. No reaching, no turning around, no sudden movements. You sit still, you breathe, and you wait. That stillness does something important. It removes uncertainty. It signals that there's nothing hidden, nothing urgent, nothing to be concerned about. Then when the officer reaches your window, you say one calm, clear sentence. Good evening, officer. My hands are on the wheel. That's it. No extra explanation, no rushing to justify anything, no scrambling for documents, just clarity and visibility. And when they ask for your license and registration, which they will, you don't immediately move. You tell them where the items are and ask for permission before reaching. My registration is in the glove box. May I reach for it? That single sentence changes the entire tone of the interaction. It shows control, transparency, and awareness, and it prevents your movements from being misinterpreted in those critical first moments. Now, compare that to what happens in the less ideal version of this exact scenario. The driver pulls over and immediately starts digging through the glove box, maybe leaning over, maybe fumbling through papers. The officer approaches and sees movement before they even make contact. That detail gets logged mentally and often later in writing. From that point forward, the stop is no longer purely routine. It's being approached with added caution. More questions, more attention, more scrutiny. Same stop, same reason for being pulled over, but a completely different trajectory, simply because of what happened in those first few seconds. This is why defense attorneys emphasize this moment so heavily. You're not just being polite, you're actively removing one of the most common triggers that leads to escalation. And once you eliminate that trigger, you've already put yourself in a stronger position before the conversation even really begins. If this is already changing how you think about traffic stops, that's exactly the point, because most people never realize how much control they actually have in these situations. And I'm curious before watching this, did you know that something as small as a taillight touch could set all of this in motion? Let me know, because what we're about to get into next is where even more drivers get tripped up. And this one happens after the conversation starts, when it feels like everything is casual, but it's anything but. Once that initial moment passes and the officer is standing at your window, most drivers feel like the pressure is over. You've made contact, you've handed things over, and now it just feels like a conversation. But this is actually where a completely different phase of the stop begins, and it's one that catches people off guard because it doesn't feel official. It feels casual. The officer might take your documents, glance at them, and then ask something that sounds harmless, almost like small talk. Where are you coming from tonight? Heading somewhere or just going home? Do you live around here? The tone is relaxed. The delivery is normal, and nothing about it feels like an interrogation. But what's really happening in that moment is information gathering. Every answer you give is being processed, remembered, and in many cases written down. And here's the part that most people don't realize. You are not legally required to answer those questions. Your legal obligation during a traffic stop is very specific. You provide your driver's license, your registration, your proof of insurance, and in some states, your name if asked directly. That's it. Everything beyond that, every casual question, every just curious comment is voluntary. But because it doesn't feel optional, most drivers answer anyway. And that's where things start to shift, because the moment you begin explaining where you've been, who you were with, or what you were doing, you're introducing variables. You might say something slightly inconsistent. You might mention being somewhere that raises follow-up questions. You might casually mention something that suddenly changes the entire direction of the stop. Not because you were doing anything concerning, but because you offered information that didn't need to be offered in the first place. This is why controlling your response in this phase is one of the strongest protections you have. And it comes down to one simple, calm sentence. When those extra questions start coming, you look at the officer and say, "Officer, I'm happy to provide my documents, but I'm going to respectfully decline to answer additional questions." Delivered once, clearly without attitude, no defensiveness, no sarcasm, no over-explaining, just a calm boundary. Because what that does is it keeps the stop focused on its original purpose. It removes the opportunity for your own words to be used to expand the situation. And it does all of that while staying completely within your legal rights. Now compare how this plays out in real situations. In the less ideal version, the driver tries to be helpful. They answer everything. "Yeah, I'm coming from downtown. I was out with a friend. Had a couple beverages, but nothing concerning." That single sentence might feel harmless in the moment, but it just introduced a new layer to the stop. One that can justify further evaluation, more questioning, and potentially a completely different outcome. In the preferred version, the driver stays controlled. They provide what's required. And when the conversation shifts beyond that, they politely decline. No extra information, no unnecessary risk, no escalation trigger. And here's the key. This isn't about being difficult or uncooperative. It's about understanding that your words have weight, and once they're said, they don't disappear. Legally, this protection is rooted in your Fifth Amendment, right to remain silent. And courts have made it clear that this right doesn't suddenly appear after an arrest. It exists during the interaction itself. That means you don't have to wait until things get serious to start being careful about what you say. You can control that from the very beginning. And when you do, the difference is measurable. Stops tend to stay shorter. They stay focused. And they're far less likely to turn into something more than what they were supposed to be. But there's one more turning point that matters even more than this. And it happens right when it feels like the stop is about to end. Right when it feels like everything is wrapping up. That's the moment you need to pay the closest attention. The officer goes back to their vehicle, runs your information, and then walks back toward you. In your mind, you're already halfway out of the situation. You're expecting your documents back, maybe a warning or a citation, and then you're on your way. But this is the exact point where many routine stops quietly shift into something much more serious. And most drivers don't even notice the transition happening because the officer often comes back in a completely different tone, more relaxed, sometimes even friendlier than before. They hand you your license and registration, and then almost seamlessly they ask something like, "So you don't have anything in the car I should know about, right?" Or "No prohibited items or substances in the vehicle." It sounds like a closing question. It feels like part of wrapping things up, but it's not. That question is the doorway into a search. It's designed to feel casual so that your guard is down right when it matters most. And this is where a lot of people make a decision that they can't take back. They respond quickly, trying to be agreeable, trying to show they have nothing to hide. No, nothing at all. You can check if you want. And right there, without realizing it, they've just given legal consent to search the vehicle. That one sentence changes everything because once consent is given, the entire dynamic shifts. The officer no longer needs additional justification. The search becomes lawful based on your permission alone. And anything found during that search, regardless of how small or unrelated, can now be documented. What felt like cooperation in the moment becomes the very thing that opens the door to a deeper investigation. And the most important part is this. You didn't have to say yes. You weren't required to say yes, but in the moment, it didn't feel like a real choice. This is why what you say right here matters more than almost anything else in the entire stop. Instead of answering that question directly, instead of getting pulled into that transition, you take control of the moment with one simple line. Thank you, officer. Am I free to go calm, neutral, and direct? That question does something powerful. It forces clarity. It requires the officer to make a decision. Either the stop is over or it isn't. There's no in-between, no vague extension disguised as conversation. If the officer says yes, the interaction is complete and you leave. No extra questions, no search, no unnecessary risk. But if the officer says no, now you know something important. You are being detained beyond the original purpose of the stop, and at that point you respond with another clear statement. Officer, I do not consent to any searches. And then you stop talking. No explanations, no arguments, no added commentary, just a clear boundary. This approach is grounded in how the law defines the limits of a traffic stop. Once the original purpose, like issuing a citation or warning, is complete, the officer can't extend the stop without a valid independent reason. And your question, am I free to go, brings that issue to the surface immediately. It prevents the stop from drifting into an open-ended investigation without you even realizing it's happening. When used consistently, this one question alone has been the difference between a quick routine stop and a prolonged encounter that leads somewhere much more serious. And by the time most people realize what's happening, that window to control it has already closed. If you've been following everything up to this point, you're already operating at a completely different level than most drivers on the road. Because the truth is, the majority of people never think about any of this until after something goes wrong. They replay the stop in their head later, realizing what they said, what they agreed to, what they didn't understand in the moment, but you're seeing it in real time before it happens. And that's where the advantage is. In fact, if you're still with me right now, just drop a quick tail light ready in the comments. Not for me, for you. It's a simple way to lock this in mentally because what we're about to cover next is the piece that ties everything together. And almost nobody does it even though it might be the most important step after the stop is over. Because once you drive away, most people treat it like it's done. The stress fades, the moment passes, and they move on with their day. But from a legal standpoint, that's actually when one of your strongest opportunities begins. Documentation. And not days later, not when something shows up in the mail, not when you're trying to remember what happened weeks after the fact, but immediately. Because memory is unreliable, especially after a stressful interaction. Small details disappear fast. The exact wording of a question, the order of events, whether something was said before or after something else, all of that starts to blur within hours. Meanwhile, the officer is trained to write a report, often the same day, while everything is still fresh. That report becomes the official version of events. So, here's what you do to balance that. As soon as the stop ends and you're somewhere safe, whether that's pulled over again briefly or when you get home, you create your own record. The easiest way to do this is with your phone. Start a voice memo and begin with a simple line. This is a record of a traffic stop on today's date. And then you walk through everything you remember while it's still clear. The time, the location, why you were pulled over, what the officer said, what you said, whether they asked to search, whether you declined, whether they touched your vehicle and where, whether there were multiple officers, whether additional resources were present, everything. You're not trying to sound perfect. You're trying to be accurate and immediate. Now think about how this plays out later if something comes up. In the less ideal scenario, a driver gets a notice or ends up in court weeks later and tries to recall what happened. Details are fuzzy. The sequence is unclear, and the only solid version of events on record is the officer's report. In the preferred scenario, the driver has a time-stamped account recorded minutes after the stop, capturing details that would otherwise be lost. That kind of documentation can be incredibly valuable. It gives an attorney something concrete to work with. It can highlight inconsistencies. It can support your version of events in a way that memory alone simply can't. And according to legal professionals, notes made immediately after an incident, what's called contemporaneous documentation, carry significantly more weight than recollections made much later. When you combine this step with everything you've already learned, your controlled behavior at the beginning, your measured responses during the stop, your clear boundary at the end, you're not just reacting anymore. You're building a complete, consistent record from start to finish. And that's something very few drivers ever think to do. But once you understand it, it becomes one of the simplest and most effective ways to protect yourself long after the stop itself is over. Now let's put all of this together in a way that makes it stick. Because the difference between knowing these steps and actually applying them comes down to seeing how they play out in a real situation. Imagine you're driving home late at night. It's quiet, not much traffic, and then suddenly you see flashing lights in your rearview mirror. You pull over safely. Your heart rate picks up a little. That's normal. But what you do next is where everything starts to separate. In one version of this scenario, the driver reacts on instinct. The car stops and immediately they lean over, open the glove box, start searching for registration, maybe shifting things around, maybe even checking their phone quickly. By the time the officer is walking up, they've already seen movement, hands disappearing, activity inside the vehicle before any contact was made. Then comes the tail light tap. The driver startles slightly, maybe turns to look back, maybe keeps moving. The officer reaches the window, asks for documents, and the driver hands them over while continuing to talk, explaining where they're coming from, offering details that weren't asked for, trying to appear cooperative. The officer walks back, returns a few minutes later, and casually asks, "You don't have anything in the car I should know about, right?" The driver, wanting to seem helpful, responds quickly, "No, nothing. You can check if you want." And just like that, the situation changes. The stop stretches longer. A search begins. What started as a simple pullover turns into a 30-40-minute encounter, all driven by small decisions that felt harmless in the moment. Now take that exact same situation, but this time the driver knows what you know. The lights come on, they pull over calmly, turn off the music, and place both hands visibly on the wheel. They don't reach for anything, they don't rush. The officer approaches, taps the tail light, and nothing changes inside the vehicle. No sudden movement, no reaction that can be misinterpreted. The officer gets to the window and the driver says calmly, "Good evening, officer. My hands are on the wheel." When asked for documents, the driver responds, "My registration is in the glove box. May I reach for it?" Slow, clear, controlled. The officer takes the documents and walks away. A few minutes later, they return and ask, "Where are you headed tonight?" The driver stays composed. "Officer, I'm going to respectfully decline to answer additional questions. No tension, no attitude, just clarity." Then comes the transition question. "Anything in the car I should know about?" And instead of answering directly, the driver says, "Thank you, officer. Am I free to go?" The officer pauses, then says, "Yes." And just like that, it's over. No search, no escalation, no unnecessary risk. Same road, same time, same reason for being pulled over, but two completely different outcomes based entirely on awareness and control. That contrast is the entire point of this video. It's not about being perfect. It's not about turning a traffic stop into a confrontation. It's about understanding where the pressure points are and handling them in a way that keeps things simple, limited, and predictable. Because once you recognize those moments, the tail light touch, the casual questions, the search transition, you stop reacting automatically and start responding intentionally. And that alone changes everything. And there's one more situation that takes this to an even higher level, because it's where a huge number of drivers get caught off guard. It's when an officer claims they detect an odor coming from your vehicle, something that can instantly be referenced to justify a search even when there's nothing concerning. That scenario has led to more contested cases and more confusion than almost anything else during traffic stops. And in the next video, I'm going to break down exactly what to say, what not to say, and how to handle that moment without making it worse. Because if you thought this was important, that situation raises the stakes even further. By now, you can probably feel how different a traffic stop looks when you understand what's actually happening beneath the surface. What most people see as a quick inconvenience is really a sequence of small, high-impact moments. And each one gives you a chance to either keep things controlled or unknowingly make them more complicated. And when you zoom out, everything we covered comes back to 4 simple actions that work together as a complete system. First, the moment that taillight gets touched, you keep your hands visible on the wheel and eliminate unnecessary movement. That alone removes one of the most common triggers that officers reference to justify increased caution. Second, when the conversation begins to drift into casual questions, you remember that you're only required to provide your documents, not your personal narrative. And by calmly declining to answer additional questions, you avoid introducing information that could be referenced to expand the stop. Third, when it feels like everything is wrapping up, instead of getting pulled into that final transition, you take control with one clear question. Am I free to go? That single line forces a legal boundary. Either the stop ends or the officer has to justify continuing it. And finally, once it's all over, you create your own record immediately, capturing the details while they're still fresh, so you're not relying on memory if anything comes up later. Individually, each of these steps is simple, but together they form something much stronger. They keep the stop focused. They reduce the chances of escalation, and they give you a level of control that most drivers don't even realize is possible. And the most important part is that every single one of these actions is grounded in established legal principles. These aren't tricks or loopholes, they're rights. The same rights that defense attorneys rely on every day when they're protecting their clients in real cases. So the next time you see those lights in your mirror, it's not just about pulling over and hoping for the best. You'll know exactly what's happening, exactly what matters, and exactly how to handle each phase from beginning to end. And that awareness alone can completely change the outcome of the interaction. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because the next breakdown, what to do when an officer claims they detect an odor coming from your car, is one of the most important scenarios you can understand, and it's where a lot of people get caught off guard. If this shifted how you think about traffic stops even a little, hit the like button so more people can see it, and drop a comment telling me which of these 4 steps surprised you the most. Stay aware, stay controlled, and most importantly, stay safe out there.